The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Academy's pristine grounds as 18-year-old Sarah Chen stepped through the massive iron gates for the first time. Her small frame barely filled out the crisp white uniform that had been issued to her just hours earlier. At 5 feet 2 inches and weighing barely 110 pounds, she looked more like someone's little sister who had wandered onto campus by mistake than a future naval officer. The other freshman midshipmen towered around her as they gathered for their first formation. Most of them were athletes who had dominated their high school football fields or basketball courts. They carried themselves with the confidence that came from years of being the biggest, strongest, or fastest in any room they entered. Sarah, on the other hand, had spent her high school years in the school library, buried in advanced mathematics and physics textbooks, dreaming of one day serving on a nuclear submarine. "Look what the wind blew in," muttered Jake Morrison, a linebacker from Texas who stood nearly 6.5 feet tall. His comment drew snickers from the group of male midshipmen clustered around him. Sarah pretended not to hear, keeping her eyes fixed straight ahead as their drill instructor began calling out names for room assignments. The first few weeks at the academy were designed to break down civilians and rebuild them into naval officers. For most of the incoming class, this meant grueling physical training sessions, endless marching drills, and academic courses that pushed them to their limits. For Sarah, it meant all of that, plus the constant whispers and sideways glances from her classmates who couldn't understand how someone so small had made it through the rigorous admission process. During mess hall meals, she often found herself sitting alone, while the other midshipmen formed tight circles around the natural leaders who had emerged from their ranks. Jake Morrison had quickly become the unofficial spokesperson for their class, his booming voice and commanding presence making him a favorite among both the male and female midshipmen. Sarah watched from her corner table as he regaled others with stories of his high school football glory days and his plans to become a Marine officer after graduation. The academic portion of their training was where Sarah first began to shine, though few people noticed. While others struggled with advanced calculus and physics, she completed assignments with an ease that bordered on the supernatural. Her instructors began to take notice, but her fellow midshipmen remained focused on the more visible measures of success at the academy. Who could do the most push-ups? Who could run the fastest mile? Who looked the most impressive in uniform? Professor Williams, who taught their nuclear engineering course, was the first faculty member to really see Sarah's potential. During a particularly challenging lecture on reactor physics, he posed a complex problem that had stumped naval engineers for months. Sarah's hand shot up before he had even finished writing the equation on the board. The solution involves adjusting the control rod positioning to account for xenon poisoning effects, she said quietly, her voice barely carrying to the back of the lecture hall. If you modify the neutron flux distribution by approximately 15% and compensate for the delayed neutron precursors, the reactor efficiency should improve by at least 12%. The room fell silent. Professor Williams stared at the small freshman who had just solved a problem that had challenged seasoned engineers. He worked through her solution on the board, his excitement growing with each calculation. She was absolutely correct. "Outstanding work, Midshipman Chen," he said, unable to hide his amazement. "That's exactly the solution the Naval Reactors program has been looking for." But instead of earning respect from her classmates, Sarah's academic success only seemed to increase their skepticism. During physical training sessions, she struggled to keep up with the larger, more athletic midshipmen. Her small frame worked against her during obstacle courses and strength training exercises. Jake Morrison and his followers began to openly question whether she belonged at the academy at all. "Book smarts don't mean much when you're trying to survive at sea," Jake commented loudly during one particularly brutal training session. Sarah had just failed to complete a rope climbing exercise that most of the other midshipmen had finished with ease. "The Navy needs officers who can lead sailors, not walking textbooks who can't even pull their own weight." The comment stung because Sarah knew there was some truth to it. Physical fitness was a crucial component of naval service, and she was clearly struggling in that area despite spending extra hours in the gym every day. She began to wonder if maybe she had made a mistake in choosing the Naval Academy. Perhaps she should have pursued a civilian career in nuclear engineering instead of trying to serve in a military that seemed designed for people completely different from herself. Her roommate, Jennifer Walsh, was one of the few people who showed her any kindness during those early weeks. Jennifer came from a military family and understood the challenges that came with being different in an environment that valued conformity. She watched Sarah struggle with both the physical demands of academy life and the social isolation that came from being dismissed by their classmates. "They don't see who you really are," Jennifer told Sarah one evening as they prepared for another demanding day of training. "But they will. People like Jake Morrison think strength only comes in one form. But they're wrong. You have something special, Sarah. I can see it. And eventually they will too." Sarah appreciated Jennifer's support, but she was beginning to doubt whether her special talents would ever be recognized or valued by her peers. The academy had always been her dream, but the reality was turning out to be much harsher than she had imagined. Every day brought new challenges that seemed designed to highlight her weaknesses while minimizing her strengths. The breaking point came during a leadership exercise in their 6th week. The midshipmen were divided into teams and given a series of tactical problems to solve under time pressure. Jake Morrison naturally assumed command of the largest group, his confident voice directing others with military precision. Sarah found herself assigned to a smaller team with several midshipmen who seemed just as uninterested in being led by her as she was in leading them. Their assigned problem involved calculating the optimal positioning for a destroyer escort during an anti-submarine warfare exercise. It was exactly the kind of complex, multivariable problem that played to Sarah's strengths, but her teammates dismissed her suggestions before she could fully explain her reasoning. "We need someone who understands real naval operations," said Mark Stevens, a midfielder from the Academy's soccer team. "This isn't a classroom theory problem. This is about actual combat situations." Sarah watched in frustration as her team chose a solution that she knew was flawed. When the exercise results were announced, their approach had failed spectacularly. While Jake Morrison's team had achieved a respectable success rate, the failure was attributed to poor leadership and lack of practical experience, exactly the kind of criticism that Sarah had been hearing since her arrival at the academy. That night, she sat alone in her room, staring at the letter she had been writing to her parents. She had been trying to find the words to explain that maybe the Naval Academy wasn't the right place for her after all. Maybe she should transfer to a civilian university where her academic abilities would be appreciated and her physical limitations wouldn't be seen as fundamental character flaws. But as she sat there with the half-written letter in her hands, Sarah remembered why she had wanted to attend the academy in the first place. It wasn't because she wanted to prove herself to people like Jake Morrison or Mark Stevens. It was because she genuinely believed she could serve her country in a meaningful way. She had spent years studying naval technology and strategy, not to impress her classmates, but because she was fascinated by the complex challenges of modern naval warfare. She crumpled up the letter and threw it in the trash. Whatever happened next, she wasn't going to quit without giving everything she had. If her classmates wanted to underestimate her, that was their mistake to make. She would focus on becoming the best naval officer she could be, regardless of whether anyone else recognized her potential. The next morning brought news that would change everything for Sarah and her fellow midshipmen. Admiral Richardson, the Academy's superintendent, had announced that their class would be participating in a special training exercise designed to test their readiness for advanced naval operations. The exercise would take place in just 2 weeks, and it would include challenges that even senior midshipmen rarely faced. Sarah felt a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness as the details were announced. This would be her chance to prove that she belonged at the academy, not because she could run faster or lift more weight than her classmates, but because she understood naval operations in ways that went far beyond physical strength. She just needed an opportunity to show what she could really do. The training exercise was unlike anything the freshman midshipmen had experienced before. Instead of the carefully controlled scenarios they had become accustomed to, this simulation would test their ability to respond to real-world naval emergencies under extreme pressure. The Academy had brought in active duty officers from the fleet to serve as evaluators, and rumors were already spreading that the results would significantly impact their future assignments. Sarah spent the days leading up to the exercise in intensive preparation. While her classmates focused primarily on physical conditioning and reviewing basic naval procedures, she dove deep into advanced tactical manuals and technical specifications for the ships and weapon systems they would be working with during the simulation. Jennifer often found her in the library at 2 in the morning, surrounded by stacks of reference materials that most midshipmen wouldn't encounter until their senior year. "You know this stuff better than some of the instructors," Jennifer observed during one of these late-night study sessions. "But are you sure you're preparing for the right things? This exercise is supposed to test leadership under pressure, not just technical knowledge." Sarah looked up from the sonar operations manual she had been studying. "Leadership without understanding is just noise," she replied. "How can you make good decisions if you don't really comprehend the capabilities and limitations of your equipment and your people?" Meanwhile, Jake Morrison was taking a completely different approach to preparation. He had organized informal leadership sessions with groups of midshipmen, running them through tactical scenarios and building the kind of personal loyalty that had served him well on the football field. His natural charisma and commanding presence made him the obvious choice whenever teams were formed for practice exercises. "The key to naval leadership is getting your people to trust you when things go bad," Jake explained to his followers during one of these sessions. "They need to know you'll make quick decisions and stick with them, even when you're not completely sure what the right answer is. Hesitation gets people killed in combat." The contrast between Jake's approach and Sarah's couldn't have been more obvious. Where he emphasized confidence and quick decision-making, she focused on thorough analysis and technical precision. Where he built personal relationships and inspired loyalty through force of personality, she preferred to let the quality of her ideas speak for themselves. Their classmates seemed to overwhelmingly prefer Jake's leadership style, which reinforced their existing beliefs about what a naval officer should look like. The morning of the exercise arrived with unusual fanfare. Admiral Richardson himself would be observing portions of the simulation, along with several senior officers from the Pacific Fleet. The midshipmen were divided into 3 groups, each assigned to different aspects of a complex multi-ship operation involving anti-submarine warfare, surface combat, and humanitarian assistance missions. Sarah found herself assigned to the submarine detection team, which was considered one of the most technically challenging aspects of the exercise. Jake Morrison was placed in command of the surface warfare group, which would coordinate the overall tactical response to the simulated emergency. The setup seemed designed to play to each of their perceived strengths, Jake leading people, Sarah working with technical systems. The scenario began with a distress call from a civilian vessel in international waters. Intelligence reports suggested the presence of hostile submarines in the area, but the exact nature and location of the threat remained unclear. The midshipmen would need to coordinate a rescue operation while simultaneously conducting anti-submarine warfare operations to protect both the civilian vessel and their own ships. Jake immediately took charge of the overall response, his voice carrying clearly across the command center as he began issuing orders to the various team leaders. His confidence was infectious, and Sarah could see why their classmates were drawn to his leadership style. He made decisions quickly and communicated them with authority that inspired immediate action. Sarah's role was to analyze sonar data and provide threat assessments to help guide the tactical decision-making process. As she began reviewing the incoming information, she immediately noticed patterns that didn't match the training scenarios they had practiced. The sonar contacts were too regular, too predictable for actual submarine operations. Real submarines would use much more sophisticated evasion techniques than what was showing up on their screens. "I'm seeing multiple contacts bearing 270 through 315, reported Mark Stevens, who was serving as Jake's primary sonar operator. "Recommend we focus our ASW assets on that sector." Jake nodded and began repositioning their simulated ships to respond to the reported contacts. But Sarah was studying the same data with growing concern. The pattern suggested that they were dealing with decoys rather than actual submarines. The real threat was probably somewhere else entirely, using the decoys to misdirect their response. "Wait," Sarah called out, her quiet voice barely audible over the noise of the command center. "Those contacts don't match actual submarine signatures. I think we're being deceived." Jake turned toward her with barely concealed irritation. "Midshipman Chen, we have clear sonar contacts and a civilian vessel in danger. We don't have time for theoretical analysis." But Sarah had already begun working through the implications of what she was seeing. If the contacts were decoys, then the real submarine was probably positioned to attack their rescue ships while they were focused on the wrong area. She quickly calculated the most likely position for an actual attack based on the tactical geometry of the situation. "The real submarine is probably here," she said, pointing to a position on the tactical display that seemed empty of contacts. "The decoys are designed to draw our attention away from the actual attack vector." Several of her teammates looked at her with skepticism. The area she was indicating showed no sonar contacts whatsoever, while the sector that Mark had identified was full of clear targets. From a conventional perspective, Jake's approach made perfect sense. Focus your limited resources on the known threats, not on empty ocean based on theoretical analysis. "Chen, I appreciate your input, but we have to deal with the reality of what we're seeing," Jake replied firmly. "We can't ignore actual contacts to chase theories about where threats might be." Sarah felt the familiar frustration of being dismissed before her ideas could be fully explained. But this time, something was different. She wasn't just another academic exercise where the consequences of being wrong were limited to a poor grade. In this simulation, lives were at stake, even if they were only simulated lives. Her analysis might be wrong, but she was certain that the conventional approach was leading them into a trap. "Permission to conduct an active sonar sweep of Sector 090, she requested, her voice stronger than usual. Jake hesitated. Active sonar would reveal their own position to any hostile submarines in the area, but it would also provide definitive information about what was actually out there. It was a calculated risk that could either confirm Sarah's theory or waste precious time and compromise their tactical position. Negative, Jake decided. We maintain passive operations and focus on the known contacts. But Sarah had already made her own decision. Using a secondary sonar console that wasn't directly under Jake's supervision, she initiated a brief, active sonar pulse directed at the sector where she believed the real submarine was hiding. The pulse lasted less than 3 seconds. But it was enough to reveal what she had suspected all along. The sonar return showed a clear submarine signature exactly where her calculations had predicted. Moreover, the submarine's position and heading suggested it was preparing to launch torpedoes at their rescue ships, which were currently moving into what would become a perfect attack position. Contact, submarine bearing 087, range 4,000 yards, on attack vector for our rescue vessels, Sarah announced, her voice cutting through the noise of the command center. The room fell silent as every operator confirmed her reading. There was indeed a submarine, exactly where she had predicted, and it was positioned for a devastating attack on their rescue mission. The contacts that had been drawing their attention were revealed as sophisticated decoys, exactly as Sarah had theorized. Jake stared at the display in shock. His entire tactical plan had been based on responding to the wrong threat. If this had been an actual combat situation, their ships would have been sailing directly into an ambush, while their anti-submarine forces were focused on targets that didn't exist. Admiral Richardson, who had been observing the exercise from the back of the command center, stepped forward with obvious interest. Midshipman Chen, explain your analysis, he commanded. Sarah felt every eye in the room focused on her as she began to explain her reasoning. She walked them through the sonar data that had initially seemed to confirm multiple submarine contacts, showing how the patterns were too regular and predictable for actual submarine operations. She demonstrated how the acoustic signatures didn't match known submarine types, and how the positioning of the contacts was designed to draw anti-submarine forces away from the most tactically advantageous attack positions. The decoys were sophisticated, but they had 3 fundamental flaws, she explained, her confidence growing as she outlined her analysis. First, they maintained too consistent a signature pattern. Real submarines would vary their acoustic emissions to avoid detection. Second, their positioning created a perfect geometric pattern that maximized visual impact on sonar displays, but didn't correspond to actual tactical advantages. Third, and most importantly, they left this sector completely empty. She pointed to the area where she had detected the real submarine. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does naval warfare. If there are decoys drawing attention to one area, the real threat has to be somewhere else. Basic tactical geometry suggested this was the most advantageous position for an actual attack. Admiral Richardson nodded slowly as she finished her explanation. And the active sonar pulse? That was a significant risk that could have compromised our position. Yes, sir, Sarah acknowledged. But passive sonar wasn't going to penetrate their stealth systems in time to prevent the attack on our rescue vessels. Sometimes you have to accept tactical risk to gain strategic advantage. A 3-second active pulse was worth the risk of confirming the threat location. The Admiral studied the tactical display for several long moments before turning back to the assembled midshipmen. "Continue the exercise," he ordered. Midshipman Morrison. "Adjust your response based on Midshipman Chen's threat assessment." Jake struggled to reorganize his tactical plan around the new information. The discovery of the real submarine had invalidated his entire approach, and he found himself relying heavily on Sarah's continued analysis to guide their response. She had not only identified the true threat but had also calculated the optimal positioning for their anti-submarine forces to neutralize it while protecting the rescue operation. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Sarah found herself in a position where her classmates were actually listening to her recommendations. Her quiet voice now carried weight as she guided their response to the evolving tactical situation. The technical knowledge that had seemed irrelevant during physical training exercises was suddenly the most valuable asset their team possessed. The exercise continued for another 2 hours, with Sarah providing critical analysis that helped them successfully complete the rescue mission while neutralizing the submarine threat. Jake, to his credit, adapted his leadership style to incorporate her expertise, though it was clear that the experience had shaken his confidence in his own abilities. When the simulation finally ended, Admiral Richardson addressed the entire group of midshipmen. "Today you learned an important lesson about the difference between leadership and command presence," he said. "True leadership means recognizing expertise wherever it exists and having the wisdom to use it effectively, even when it challenges your preconceptions." His eyes found Sarah in the crowd. "Midshipman Chen, your analysis was exceptional. You demonstrated exactly the kind of technical expertise and strategic thinking that the Navy needs in its submarine warfare officers." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction that went far beyond simple academic achievement. For the first time since arriving at the academy, she had proven that her unique combination of technical knowledge and analytical thinking could make a real difference in naval operations. Her classmates were looking at her with newfound respect, though she could see that some of them were still struggling to reconcile her small physical stature with her obvious tactical abilities. The weeks following the exercise brought a dramatic shift in how Sarah's classmates viewed her capabilities. Word of her performance had spread throughout the academy, and she found herself being approached by midshipmen who had previously ignored her existence. Even Jake Morrison began seeking her input during tactical discussions, though his pride still made it difficult for him to fully acknowledge how wrong he had been about her abilities. Professor Williams was the first to formally recognize what had happened during the exercise. He requested a private meeting with Sarah to discuss her future career path within the Navy. As they sat in his office, surrounded by models of nuclear submarines and photographs from his own naval service, he explained how rare it was to see such advanced tactical thinking from a freshman midshipman. "What you demonstrated during that exercise wasn't just good academic work," he told her. "You showed genuine operational intuition, the ability to see patterns that others miss, to think several steps ahead of conventional tactical responses. That's exactly what we need in submarine warfare officers." Sarah listened carefully as he outlined the opportunities that might be available to her if she chose to specialize in submarine operations. The Navy's submarine force was highly selective, accepting only the most technically qualified and mentally sharp officers. Her performance during the exercise had already attracted attention from submarine squadron commanders who were always looking for exceptional talent. "There's something else you should know," Professor Williams continued, his tone becoming more serious. "Admiral Richardson has been in contact with some people at naval reactors. They're interested in having you participate in an advanced training program this summer. It's usually reserved for senior midshipmen, but your technical abilities are already at that level." The offer was both exciting and intimidating. Naval Reactors was the organization responsible for all nuclear propulsion in the Navy, and their training programs were notoriously demanding. Being invited to participate as a freshman was almost unprecedented, but it would also mean spending her summer break immersed in even more intensive technical training while her classmates relaxed or participated in traditional military exercises. Sarah accepted the opportunity without hesitation. She had always been driven by the desire to push herself to the limits of her abilities, and the chance to work with the Navy's most advanced nuclear technology was irresistible. Her parents were concerned about the additional pressure, but they also recognized how important this opportunity was for their daughter's future career. The Naval Reactors Training Program took place at a facility in Idaho that most Navy personnel would never see during their entire careers. Sarah found herself working alongside senior officers and civilian nuclear engineers who had decades of experience with submarine reactors. The technical challenges were unlike anything she had encountered at the academy, requiring her to integrate complex physics concepts with practical engineering solutions under extreme time pressure. For the first time in her life, Sarah was surrounded by people who valued technical excellence above all other considerations. Physical size and conventional leadership presence meant nothing when you were trying to solve reactor control problems or design new safety systems. What mattered was the ability to think clearly under pressure and to understand the intricate relationships between dozens of interconnected systems. Her fellow participants initially viewed her with the same skepticism she had encountered at the academy. Most of them were senior officers with years of nuclear training and operational experience. Sarah was not only the youngest person in the program by several years, but also the smallest and least experienced. However, her performance quickly earned their respect in ways that felt completely different from her academy experience. During one particularly challenging simulation exercise, the participants were presented with a reactor emergency scenario that had no standard solution. A cooling system failure combined with a control rod malfunction had created a situation that required innovative thinking rather than textbook responses. While the more experienced officers struggled to adapt their conventional training to the unique circumstances, Sarah approached the problem with fresh eyes. She spent 45 minutes analyzing the reactor physics and developing a completely new approach to managing the emergency. Her solution involved using the reactor's own neutron flux patterns to create a stable configuration that would allow for safe shutdown without risking thermal damage to critical components. It was an elegant solution that none of the senior officers had considered, partly because it required calculations that most people couldn't perform without computer assistance. "How did you develop that approach so quickly?" asked Commander Peterson, a submarine captain with 15 years of experience who had been struggling with the same problem. "I've never seen that technique in any of our training manuals." Sarah explained her reasoning, showing how she had combined principles from several different areas of nuclear physics to create a new method for managing the specific emergency they were facing. Her explanation revealed not just technical competence, but the kind of innovative thinking that the Navy desperately needed as submarine technology became increasingly complex. Word of her performance reached Admiral Richardson back at the Academy, and he began following her progress with personal interest. He had seen many promising midshipmen during his career, but Sarah's combination of technical brilliance and tactical insight was genuinely unusual. He started making plans for her continued development that went far beyond the standard academy curriculum. When Sarah returned to the academy for her sophomore year, she found that her reputation had preceded her. The story of her performance during the freshman exercise had become legendary among the midshipmen, and her success in the Naval Reactors program had only added to her mystique. She was no longer the overlooked freshman who struggled with physical training. She had become someone that other midshipmen sought out for advice on technical subjects and tactical problems. Jake Morrison was one of the first to approach her when she returned to campus. His attitude toward her had undergone a complete transformation during the months since their first exercise together. He had spent his summer participating in a Marine Corps leadership program, where he had learned valuable lessons about recognizing and utilizing different types of expertise within a team. "I owe you an apology," he told her during one of their first conversations of the new academic year. "I was wrong about what makes a good naval officer. I thought leadership was just about being loud and confident, but you showed me that real leadership means understanding the situation better than anyone else, and making decisions based on knowledge rather than just instinct." Sarah appreciated his apology, but she was more interested in moving forward than dwelling on past conflicts. She had learned valuable lessons during her freshman year about the importance of perseverance and self-confidence, but she had also discovered that her unique abilities could make a real contribution to naval operations. She was ready to continue developing those abilities and to help her classmates understand how different types of expertise could work together effectively. The most significant change came during advanced tactics courses, where the academy began incorporating more complex scenarios that required both technical expertise and leadership skills. Sarah found herself naturally taking charge during exercises that involved submarine warfare or nuclear operations, while Jake and others led during scenarios that emphasized traditional surface warfare or amphibious operations. Their instructors began using their partnership as an example of how effective naval teams could combine different types of strengths. Jake's natural leadership abilities and inspirational presence worked perfectly with Sarah's technical expertise and analytical thinking. Together, they could handle operational challenges that neither could have managed alone. The culmination of their development came during the senior capstone exercise, a weeks-long simulation that tested everything the midshipmen had learned during their time at the academy. The scenario involved a complex multi-theater operation that required coordination between submarines, surface ships, and land-based forces. Sarah was selected as the submarine warfare specialist, while Jake served as the overall operational commander. The exercise began with what appeared to be a straightforward anti-piracy mission in international waters. However, as the situation developed, it became clear that they were actually dealing with a sophisticated state-sponsored operation involving advanced submarines and coordinated attacks on commercial shipping. The challenge required them to adapt their tactics in real time, as new intelligence revealed the true scope of the threat they were facing. Sarah's role was to coordinate the submarine response while providing technical analysis to support the overall tactical plan. But 42 seconds into a critical phase of the operation, everything changed. A simulated torpedo attack on their command ship created an emergency situation that required immediate response from the senior officer present. Jake, who should have been in command, was simulated as being injured in the attack. Suddenly, Sarah found herself in overall command of a complex multi-ship operation with dozens of simulated lives hanging in the balance. The junior officers who had been taking orders from Jake now looked to her for leadership during the most critical moments of the exercise. She had to make split-second decisions about submarine deployments, surface ship positioning, and coordinated attacks, while managing the personalities and capabilities of officers who had different specialties and experience levels. Those 42 seconds became the defining moment of Sarah's academy career. Her voice, which had once been too quiet to command attention, now carried across the command center with absolute authority. The technical knowledge that had once seemed irrelevant to leadership suddenly became the foundation for tactical decisions that saved the entire operation. Her small physical stature became irrelevant as she demonstrated that true command presence came from competence and confidence, rather than size and volume. The exercise evaluators later described her performance during those critical moments as exceptional. She had successfully coordinated a complex response that neutralized multiple submarine threats while protecting civilian vessels and her own forces. More importantly, she had demonstrated the ability to adapt her leadership style to the specific demands of the situation, using her technical expertise to inspire confidence in subordinates who had initially questioned her authority. Admiral Richardson was present for the final debriefing, and his comments about Sarah's performance would be remembered by her classmates for years to come. "Midshipman Chen," he said, addressing the assembled senior class, "you have demonstrated that excellence comes in many forms. Your classmates initially dismissed you because you didn't fit their preconceptions about what a naval officer should look like, but you proved that true leadership is based on competence, dedication, and the ability to make good decisions under pressure." He paused and looked directly at her. "The Navy needs officers who can think beyond conventional approaches, who can see solutions that others miss, and who can adapt to rapidly changing situations. You have shown all of those qualities, and I expect to see great things from your naval career." Sarah's journey from dismissed freshman to recognized leader had taken nearly 4 years, but the transformation was complete. She had proven that her unique combination of technical expertise, analytical thinking, and quiet determination could be just as valuable as traditional leadership qualities. Her classmates, who had once questioned whether she belonged at the academy, now sought her out as a mentor and collaborator. The 42 seconds that had defined her senior exercise became symbolic of everything she had achieved at the academy. In that brief moment, she had demonstrated that true naval leadership came not from meeting other people's expectations, but from developing your own unique capabilities to their fullest potential, and then using them in service of something larger than yourself. As graduation approached, Sarah received orders to report to submarine school for advanced training in nuclear operations. Her dream of serving on a nuclear submarine was finally becoming reality, and she knew that the lessons she had learned about perseverance and self-confidence would serve her well in the challenges ahead. She had proven that excellence could not be dismissed, regardless of how it was packaged, and that the Navy was stronger when it embraced all forms of talent and expertise.